and welcome to History by the Pint, the podcast series that discusses all things history and archaeology in the time it takes to drink a pint. My name is Alex Rosen, I'm a producer and writer, and with me is Chris Shavitsky, a lecturer and researcher in Rome. It's one of those great historical facts that today there are more ancient Egyptian obelisks in Italy than there are in Egypt. In this episode, we're going to be looking at why that is, and the story of the first obelisks to arrive in Rome. So Chris, a few weeks ago, on a very hot day in Rome, you and I visited two rather remarkable monuments, Augustus's obelisks. These two huge granite monoliths, both over 20 metres high and weighing well over 200 tonnes, they were erected in Rome in 10 BC by the first emperor. One was in the Circus Maximus, Rome's famous hippodrome, and the other in the Campus Martius, the Fields of Mars, in the crook of the River Tiber. Rather amazingly, both can still be visited today, but not in their original locations, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, when you were out here, we started at Piazza del Popolo, which is laid out in the 19th century by an architect called Valadier, but the obelisk gets moved there by Pope Sixtus V. They discover it collapsed, put it slightly back together, and bring it across Rome, put it up in a different location, and likewise, the second obelisk that Augustus brings to Rome is discovered in the 18th century, found in, I think it's 3 or 5 parts, I can't remember, and it's pretty badly damaged. They have to patch it up. They take apart the column, a massive, enormous 60 Roman foot, so that's about 56 of our feet, as one granite column of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. They take that apart, use the granite to patch up the Augustan obelisk, and they put that up at Montecitorio in Rome, not too far from where it was originally placed, which is now just outside of the Italian Parliament building.
It's interesting, isn't it? Going back to the origin of obelisks, these huge, like we said, these Aswan granite monoliths that are cut from this special quarry quite far down the Nile, actually. And the manpower that was needed to literally pound these things out of the ground. So they were doing it, archaeologists believe, with these sort of dolerite pounders that was harder than granite. And you can imagine how hard that must have been to carve these things and then prise them from the rock. Then you've got to get them onto your river transport up the Nile, and then you've got to erect them. And the Egyptians often had pairs, or most of the time had pairs of these obelisks erected together outside of the temple complexes, usually to the god Ra. And you think the amount of effort that they went through to do that. And we have, centuries later, Augustus doing, well, okay, most of the obelisks have been cut already, but he's still investing an incredible amount of manpower and expertise, and also engineering to get these things to Rome, because although they had come up the Nile, they'd never gone across the sea before. And I think there's this German archaeologist, researcher, who's done a lot of work on sort of reconstructing how they did it. But we know from the ancient sources that the feat in itself of bringing them from Egypt to Rome was worthy of, incredible adulation amongst the people. And I think one of these ships was even kept at Puteoli in the south of Italy and displayed to the public before it burnt down. And Pliny tells us this. So we have, I guess, the recognition of this sort of pharaonic feat being replayed by Augustus. But what's happening in Rome during this time? Because Augustus is sort of changing the face of Rome a little bit, isn't he? Why does he need them?
Well, so there's a tendency to think that Augustus does all of this at once. So Augustus very, very famously defeats Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium, and then 30 defeats them properly and ends up annexing Egypt. And Egypt becomes a province specifically administered by the imperial family, or by Augustus, not by the Senate. And so there's, on the one hand, Egypt is suddenly brought within the empire, and everything that entails about it, everything from its grain, which is probably the most important thing, but all of its wealth and its culture. But there is a tendency to think, oh, Augustus does this, and then that, Augustus reigns for 44 years. It's a very long time. And his policy towards lots of things changes. The obelisks are brought over on the 20th anniversary of the annexation of Egypt. They're not brought over immediately. We know this because of the inscriptions on the bases of the obelisk that say that they're brought over, at the same time that they say that they're dedicated to the sun. And yes, on the one hand, they're some kind of symbol of conquest, I suppose. It is celebrating that, but it's not as straightforward. And also this idea that suddenly Augustus conquers Egypt, or Octavian, as he's supposedly called then. I think he's meant to be called Imperator Caesar, but anyway, Augustus conquers Egypt, and then there's this massive fad of Egyptomania. Like people want Egyptian stuff everywhere. The Romans, for decades before, had been interested in Egyptian culture and Egyptian imagery. I mean, actually, centuries before. You could go to the south of Italy and in the 6th century and 5th century BC, and you will find loads of Egyptian-looking artifacts that are being either imported or manufactured locally to look like that. So Augustus is not the first, and it's not just in the Augustan period that people in Rome are interested in Egypt and Egyptian imagery. But it does kick something off in the sense that it remains a constant for the next couple of generations in Rome, these links with Egypt.
It was very striking, actually, going to some of the museums, like we did on that tour, and just suddenly being confronted with an entire room of these fantastic black basalt statues of monkeys and sphinxes and pharaohs, and some of great antiquity and some also being made at the time for, to satisfy this wave of Egyptomania. And I guess for archaeologists, the luckiest thing is that these things do tend to survive, and some are damaged, but these huge, great, weighty stone monoliths and giant stone statues are good for us because they do survive when so much else doesn't. And I am very interested in the idea of what Romans selected once they had plundered various areas, and the obelisks, I guess. You can call them in some ways trophies or plunder. Okay, they're erected 20 years after the annexation, but, they do bear that sort of inscription that says something like, what is it? Having been bought under the power of the Roman people, these are from Egypt, this is to the god's soul. So you have a sort of very militaristic overtone as well. And I love the idea of Augustus sort of trumping everyone in a way. People have got their Egyptian frescoes and jewelry and statues and whatever, but he comes along 20 years later and absolutely with a trump card of having the resources and the people under his command that can actually bring these fantastic monuments to Rome. And I'm very interested in the story of there potentially being this test run that might have taken place a little bit earlier, maybe around sort of 14, 15 BC, where there were two other obelisks transported up the Nile from Heliopolis to Alexandria for Caesareum, this grand sort of forum. And that might have been in some ways the test run for two other obelisks from Heliopolis, again selected and being brought across the seas to be erected in two very interesting locations, I guess. I mean, the Circus Maximus, the Hippodrome of Rome, obviously an incredibly popular public space. You put something there, it's going to be seen. But the other obelisk in some ways has a more interesting story, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So he brings one over, puts it in the Circus Maximus, which is a very public place to display it, and actually becomes emblematic of circuses everywhere. And then this other obelisk brings over and seems to set out a horologium, sometimes called probably incorrectly a sundial, but some kind of and people dispute over this, but some kind of effectively calendar,
A meridian? Calendar.
meridian, horologium. I don't really know the difference between all of them, but effectively on the Campus Martius lays out in the pavement a meridian or a horologium, and the obelisk acts as the nomen, the pointer of it. And so when the sun shines down, the shadow that is cast by the obelisk is meant to hit, the relevant part, as you'd expect on a meridian today. We're told, so Pliny the Elder, writing in the mid-70s AD, so some 80 odd years later, he describes this, and he says that on Augustus's birthday, the nomen hits the Ara Pacis, which is an altar that's put up by the Senate to Rome to celebrate Augustan peace. But Pliny says in his day it doesn't work anymore, in that something's gone. He gives us the name of the guy that designs it all and everything like that and lays it out. And, there's no reason to doubt that at some point it existed, or worked, sorry. But Pliny says it doesn't work in his day. And then shortly after Pliny's writing, there's another enormous fire in Rome. Pavement level gets raised, and it seems they relay this meridian line, and you can see it. One part, well, two parts of it have been found, but one part is still visible with permission to go and see underneath a house that's laid out in the pavement from probably the reign of Domitian as well.
Did you go and see that this year on your while guiding the students around?
Yeah, took students to see it, which is great. Where it is in Rome, it's under the water table actually. So you go there and you look down and it's underwater. Yeah, if you could knock down everyone's house and dig up the rest of it. It'd be interesting. It'd settle everyone's arguments about it. And not far from there now is the obelisk itself, in the wrong place because it was found. There's a little plaque, as we saw when we were there, above someone else's house of where they found the obelisk in the 18th century.
But the Italian, I don't know who designed it. The Italians have had a go at laying out this sort of, whether it was a meridian strip measuring the midday sun throughout the year. They've had a go at that, and I hadn't realised that. And it was quite interesting having a look and seeing the strip running up towards what the Houses of Parliament is sort of very
Yeah, exactly. So
very symbolic.
You go see the obelisk now, and it is a good, I don't know what, 200 meters away from where it should be. Useless with distances. But anyway, it's not where it should be. It's been moved, and it's now next to the Italian Parliament building. And yeah, they've got a meridian line that runs up, and I think we worked out it kind of works. I think
Yeah, there was something there.
it's problematic because it should be flat, but the Parliament building's on a slight hill, which is probably an ancient rubbish dump of amphora material called Montecitorio. The Parliament being built on rubbish is, yeah, I don't know what your comment is.
It's not going there.
No, exactly. It was, in fairness, it was an older building before the Parliament moved in. But yeah, it had this very specific. It's clearly all of this stuff is, on the one hand, yeah, it's connected to Egypt, but it's connected to Augustus, and he's laying out this part of the Campus Martius on an acknowledgement of his regime. It also ties into calendar reforms that have been carried out by his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. All revolutions, and Augustus, as much as he claims he's restoring the Republic, is on some level carrying out a revolution, which is the establishment of a dynastic monarchy. They want to control time. And Augustus is, on some level, very publicly, very visibly controlling time over the calendar in this way.
It's very interesting, isn't it? And I think, maybe it's taking it too far, but you think of the intellectual weight and importance that Alexandria had as being the home of, wisdom and intellectuals and inventions and things. And here we have Augustus. Okay, it's tied into calendar reforms and things like that, but it's a very obvious public display of science, of understanding the way the world works. And I'm quite interested in that being placed within this complex of monuments that he's constructed or is constructing in the Campus Martius, which is quite difficult. I mean, revisiting it again with you, like you say, it's quite difficult to get a sense of today, isn't it? Because there's one monument here, and then you have to sort of go down the streets to another monument, and then there's the Aura Pacis, not in its original position, but it's sort of, in this beautiful glass museum. And the mausoleum is still there, obviously in the same place, and that is quite close to completion or the completed restoration, which was great to see, actually. And I think you mentioned it before, the piazza outside, it's been opened and you can see in there, and you get a really good idea of the size of this place. But yeah, I mean, what do you think was the significance of this complex, of there being Augustus's mausoleum that's set up potentially as a dynastic mausoleum, the cremation site somewhere nearby, Aura Pacis as well, and the obelisk in the middle, I guess, sort of the needle that threads these things together. What's your sort of take on it?
So we don't precisely know what the Campus Martius looks like before Augustus. There's a model that shows you it's completely empty. It's probably not completely empty. Certainly, there's quite a lot of tombs that we know around there, but it's a relatively underutilized space, technically outside of the city, outside of the walls, outside the sacred boundary. And Augustus, starting with his mausoleum, begins to construct a series of major monuments around that, as well as his good friend, right hand man, at some point adoptive son Agrippa, also who constructs the Pantheon. Julius Caesar, actually, in the Campus Martius, was building things, the site to the new voting pens. And the area becomes very much a Julio-Claudian space of, you have got other people there, Pompey's Theatre and things, but you know, Augustus on some level is taking charge of that part of the city, and it's his mausoleum that dominates. This is the largest mausoleum, and until that of Hadrian, it's absolutely enormous. And then just down from that, what, some 20 years later, he lays out the obelisk and the meridian line. Yeah, and so, his mausoleum, which is dedicated in 28 BC, Augustus doesn't die till 14 AD, so the mausoleum, it preempts his death by, what, 3.5 decades. It's been argued by scholars very reasonably. He does this on some level in response to Mark Antony supposedly having stipulated that he would wanted to be buried in Alexandria. And Rome has always had a paranoia about the capital being transferred elsewhere. I mean, maybe that gives a new dimension to Augustus taking things from Egypt and bringing them to Rome. But he sets up his mausoleum in 28 BC. Around that, there's public parks, and then he lives for so long. He's burying other members of his family inside that mausoleum, and then begins to establish this greater Campus Martius with these monuments that are put up either by him, by the Senate, or by Marcus Agrippa in that area. The interesting thing is, yeah, on the one hand, it's massively successful perhaps in his reign, but it doesn't last forever, because what you end up finding is, so the altar of peace, the Ara patches of Augustus. Well, by the 3rd century AD, there's a massive insular block, what's probably on the ground floor, some kind of production or commercial space, and then housing above, is built within 5 meters of this sacred building. The obelisk of Augustus with the meridian line has clearly ceased to function by Pliny's day. The Emperor Domitian seems to relay the paving. But I think, again, by the 3rd century, where the meridian line was, actually, it's sunk down in the pavement. Like the ground level keeps raising, so it's sunk down. They cordon part of it off and turn it into some kind of water feature. So Augustus has these plans for this area, and obviously his mausoleum dominates the area, but gradually the realities of a massive urban city that's expanding, people want more places to live, seems to start to encroach on what was a monumental space. Actually becomes, well, there's monuments around, but then people start to build up a, not necessarily at that point up against them, but close by them as well, as all cities should be, in the sense that you can only fence off that kind of space for so long to remember some long dead emperor before people start to do other things around it.
But even though his burial complex might sort of be less visible in the landscape, the idea of these obelisks goes on, doesn't it, with people trying to replicate Augustus's monumental achievements and moving them, and we see obelisk after obelisk after obelisk coming into Rome and being erected around the city for various purposes. But eventually, a lot of them do eventually fall or topple or go from the skyline. When do they sort of re-emerge back onto the stage in Rome then?
Well, so there is this idea that the so-called barbarians pull them down. I'm not sure there's much evidence for that whatsoever, but if you read the inscription above where the one in Montecitorio was found, so it was pulled down by kind of Germanic barbarians or so, I don't think there's much evidence for that. Earthquakes, I imagine, are the main thing that ends up leveling them. The only one that's been standing since antiquity is the Vatican obelisk, but then that got moved round the front of St. Peter's. But it has been standing since antiquity. The big move comes in the Renaissance and in the late Renaissance, where they rediscover some of these, or perhaps they know they're there, I don't know, but they rediscover them, and then decide to put them back up, reappropriating them for the Christian church. And so that's why you see crucifixes on top of many. But then this continues. The Montecitorio one is put up in the 18th century. It was known about before then, but it was only excavated, I think, a little bit later. There were two outside the mausoleum of Augustus. We don't know when they were put there, certainly by the 4th century, but possibly earlier. They get dug up relatively late. And then this one, the latest one, is put up, I think it's called the Dongali monument, which is next to Termini Station, to these 500 Italian soldiers that are killed out in Abyssinia in, I think it's 1911, or certainly early 20th century. So this idea of excavating and putting them up is something that's been constant since the Renaissance, and also, I suppose, probably a massive interest in hieroglyphics. Not that they could understand them, but the Vatican has a very large Egyptian collection, which is mostly formed of objects from Rome. But also in the 19th century, the Vatican were launching expeditions to Egypt to go and study things.
Yeah, yeah. Sort of the new wave of Egyptomania in sort of the 19th century and the eventual, decipherment of hieroglyphics feeding into that. Yeah.
Yeah, Egypt hold this massive fascination. Going like in antiquity, they are fascinated by Egypt, and we're told Germanicus, another of the Julio Claudians, when he's out in Egypt, he's fascinated by it and he goes to explore things. It clearly holds, and maybe it's the antiquity and the monumentality of the place, but it clearly holds a fascination. And bringing obelisks over again is something. Well, we see it in the 19th century when you've got on Thames Embankment in London, Cleopatra's Needle in America, in Paris. There's a real interest.
But also an interest in ways to express that sort of, well, that old imperial sort of trope, isn't it? If the great empires of the past can do it, we can do it too. And by doing that, you are, in some ways making that comparison. So behind it all is the bravado and the soft power, I guess, of these large emerging empires. And yeah, ending up obelisks in France and Britain and America and you name it, they're everywhere. I mean, it must be one of the oldest sort of forms of power, basically, that's known in history, right? These, if you reach the top of your game, you erect an obelisk, and that seems to have started in Egypt and gone up into the modern day. It is fascinating. Anyway, let's call time on our pint for today, Chris. But yeah, great catching up with you. It was great being out in Rome as well with you. And yeah, let's catch up for another chat real soon. Okay, bye then.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye bye.